You start a startup in Europe, and at some point someone says, "Have you considered Delaware?" Not Germany, not France, not the Netherlands, Delaware, in the United States. So here's the question. Why do European startups incorporate in Delaware? And can the EUINC stop it? For those of you who are not familiar with it, Delaware is a state in the United States where startups from all over the world usually incorporate because it has some legal advantages. The European Union is now trying to establish something similar and it calls it EUINC. Let's break this down in simple terms. In this video, I'll explain what Delaware gives founders and investors, what Europe has been missing, what EUINC is trying to fix, and what it can't fix. Many European founders incorporate in Delaware because when fundraising gets serious, Delaware is the default language investors understand. And the real problem is not Europe versus the United States. The real problem is that Europe is one market in theory, but in startup paperwork, it still behaves like 27 different markets. So, when a startup wants to scale across Europe, the founder hits friction. Different corporate rules, different equity norms, different option rules, and different investor expectations. And investors hate uncertainty. So, what does Delaware actually offer you? First, a predictable template. Delaware is famous because the rules are clear, standard, and investor-friendly. Second, it reduces negotiation time. You waste less time negotiating basics with partners and investors, you focus on the product, growth, and money. And third, Delaware sends the signal that we are playing the global VC game. So, even if you are building in Europe, your legal context becomes Delaware. This is exactly why the EUINC concept exists. EUINC is Europe trying to create a single startup-friendly company structure across the EU, sometimes also called the 28th regime. The basic idea is simple. One Europe, one standard. So, what would EUINC change in practice? First, faster and simpler incorporation. The goal is to make forming and operating across Europe much easier and with more standardized processes. Second, standard rules for what investors care about. In other words, EUINC is trying to give Europe a Delaware-like standard interface. And third, a stronger investable Europe story. It supports the EU's agenda to reduce fragmentation and make cross-border business simpler. Now let's see what EUINC probably won't fix. Even if it becomes real, it won't magically make Europe identical to the United States. Many things that shape startup reality are still national, such as taxes, labor rules, social security systems, local bureaucracy, courts, and enforcement. So, EUINC can reduce a big part of the friction, especially the corporate layer. But it doesn't erase all the differences inside Europe overnight. The best way to think about it is this. EUINC could remove a major startup tax, the paperwork and investor friction tax. But it won't remove every real friction founders face. So, can EUINC stop European founders from choosing Delaware? Here is the real answer. It depends on whether EUINC becomes the default standard for European VC deals. Because this is not just law, this is habit. Delaware wins because lawyers are trained for it, investors are used to it, documents are standardized. For EUINC to compete, it must become predictable, widely adopted, trusted by investors, and easy for lawyers to execute. So, what should you do as a founder? If you're early stage, don't obsess. It doesn't matter if you start as EUINC or in Germany or France or in Delaware. But if you're raising serious VC capital, then pay attention. The real question at that moment becomes, do you intend to become a European startup or a global one? If your focus is Europe, EUINC could make sense. But if your goal is to go global, remember that things don't change overnight. Delaware didn't become the golden standard for startups overnight, and neither can the EUINC do. European investors still invest in Delaware, plus Delaware makes access to the US VC market easier, and legislation and rules are all predictable. The EU is not creating EUINC primarily for founders. It's creating it for Europe's competitiveness. Founders should understand this and think strategically for themselves. Europe is pushing the EUINC agenda to stop losing startups capital and scale to other systems. And that's not a bad thing, but it means founders shouldn't blindly assume that this is designed specifically for their needs. Founders still need to think for themselves, understand the trade-offs, and choose what actually works for their company. In other words, EUINC exists because Europe needs it, but founders should use it only if it actually serves them better. I hope this video helped you understand the question Delaware versus EUINC, and if you like this video, check the link below where I published an article on the website EuroFounders.org with more information about EUINC. Thank you, bye bye.